There is a moment in January in Nebraska when the sky stops being a sky. It becomes something else, something with intention. The blue drains out of it over the course of a single afternoon, and what replaces it is not gray exactly. Not the gentle gray of an overcast day in November, or the soft gray of a morning that has not decided to be anything yet. It is the gray of iron, the gray of something cold and dense and absolutely certain of what it is about to do. Men who have ranched the sandhills of Cherry County for any length of time learn to read that sky the way other men read a barometer. They learn it not from a book, but from the particular education that comes from being wrong once and never wanting to be wrong about it again. Rupert Voss had been reading that sky for 68 years. He had been reading it from the same ground, the same 480 acres in the sandhills southeast of Valentine, Nebraska, where the grass-covered dunes rolled away in every direction like a frozen ocean, and the wind came across them without anything to slow it down. Cherry County is the largest county in Nebraska, nearly 6,000 square miles, bigger than Connecticut, with a population of about 6,000 people, one person per square mile of grassland and sand and scone. When winter decided to come to this place, it came without apology and without any particular concern for the people who had chosen to build their lives here. Rupert had chosen it. Or rather, the choice had been made for him by the men who came before him, and he had confirmed it every year since 1947 by staying. His grandfather Heinrich Voss had homesteaded this land in 1894. A Czech immigrant who had spent 12 years working other men's farms in eastern Nebraska before he had enough saved to buy his own ground. Heinrich had come from Moravia, a region where winters were not the polite inconveniences they were in the more temperate parts of America, but genuine tests of whether a family would survive until spring. He brought very little with him from Moravia: a few tools, a trunk of clothes, a wife who was as practical as he was and twice as patient, and a set of ideas about cold and fire and how a man with good sense dealt with the relationship between them. In 1923, when Heinrich was old and his son Clem was running the operation, Heinrich built something in the calving barn that nobody else in Cherry County had or wanted. He ordered cast iron plates from a foundry in Omaha and assembled them himself over the course of a summer into a hot water boiler, roughly 4 feet long and 2 feet wide and 3 feet high, with a firebox that held 40 pounds of wood and a water jacket surrounding it that held 30 gallons. From the boiler, a loop of iron pipe ran along the base of the barn wall, 60 feet of it, circulating water that the fire heated to 160 degrees. No pump, no electricity, no moving parts of any kind except the water itself, which rose when it was hot and fell when it cooled, drawing more heat from the firebox in a continuous loop that required nothing from the modern world to function. It was the same principle that heated apartment buildings in New York and office towers in Chicago, scaled down to the dimensions of a Nebraska calving barn and fueled by wood that a man cut himself from the cottonwood in elm stands along the Niobrara River, half a mile to the south. Heinrich had learned this system in Moravia, where it was not considered ingenious or old-fashioned or anything other than simply how you kept animals alive in winter when the temperature dropped below what animals could survive on their own. He brought the knowledge to Nebraska because Nebraska winters, he had decided after his first one, were not so different from Moravian winters, and a man who forgot what he knew because he had crossed an ocean was a fool. Clem Voss maintained the boiler through the 30s and 40s. He taught Rupert to load the firebox at age 12, not as a lesson in history or heritage, as a practical matter. The firebox needed to be loaded, and Rupert was old enough to do it, so Rupert did it. He learned the weight of the wood and the feel of the iron, and the sound the water made in the pipe when the fire was burning hot versus burning cool. He learned to read the temperature of the iron at the far end of the loop, to know whether the circulation was moving properly. He learned to smell the smoke to determine whether a piece of wood was seasoned enough to burn clean or whether it needed another month of drying. The boiler talked to him. He listened. It was that simple. By 1947, when Rupert came home from the war and married Marta Skolka, whose father owned the land adjacent to the Voss property, and by 1952, when Rupert and Marta had consolidated the two operations into the 480 acres they ran together, the boiler was already 29 years old. Nobody in Cherry County used anything like it. The neighboring ranches had moved to propane through the 50s and 60s, and by the late 60s, Clint Darby's heating supply business in Valentine was selling forced air propane systems to every calving barn in eastern Cherry County. Thermostat controlled, automatic ignition, 30,000 BTU. The kind of system that ran itself and did not require a man to leave his warm house at 2 in the morning to feed a firebox. Clint Darby had been making his feelings about Rupert's boiler known at the co-op in Valentine for the better part of 15 years. He was a lean man with a salesman's posture and a salesman's conviction that whatever he was selling was genuinely the right thing for the person he was selling it to. He had been in the heating business long enough to believe that propane was not just a product, but a form of progress. And a man who refused to adopt it was not just a difficult customer, but a man who was holding himself back from something better. He said this in so many words to Rupert at the co-op on a Saturday morning in the fall of 1976, loud enough for the counter crowd to hear. Rupert, he said, you are heating a calving barn with a wood boiler in 1977. My grandmother heated her house with a wood stove in 1920. That was 60 years ago. Rupert finished his coffee. He paid for his supplies. He drove home. He did not argue with Clint Darby because he had decided long ago that the most efficient use of a man's words was to say things that needed to be said and to not say things that did not need to be said. What Clint Darby did not understand, what the co-op counter crowd did not understand, what almost nobody in Cherry County seemed able to understand, was that Rupert's boiler was not stubbornness. It was not sentiment. It was not the refusal of a backward man to accept the progress of his era. It was a technology that Rupert Voss understood completely, from the cast iron of the firebox to the last foot of pipe along the far wall. And that understanding was the point, not the age of the machine, not the method of fuel. The fact that when something went wrong with it, Rupert knew what had gone wrong and how to fix it with tools he had in his hands and knowledge he had in his head, without calling anyone, without ordering parts that might not arrive, without depending on a system he did not control. He had replaced the grate bars in 1962 when they warped from heat cycling. He had resealed the water jacket in 1968 using a gasket compound a plumber in Valentine had recommended. He had straightened a section of pipe in 1971 that a cow had bent by leaning against it. Every repair done by hand, every repair successful. The boiler had no serial number and no manufacturer's plate and no warranty. It had Rupert. The woodpile was the other thing nobody understood. It sat behind the barn in 4 rows, each row 60 feet long and 6 feet high. Cottonwood elm and red cedar harvested every summer from the Niobrara corridor that bordered the Voss property to the south. Rupert cut it himself, split it by hand, stacked it to dry through the fall. The neighbors had been making the same joke about the woodpile for years. Rupert's out there with his chainsaw again. Somebody ought to tell him what year it is. What they saw was a man doing unnecessary work in a county where propane was delivered to your tank by truck, and all you had to do was write a check. What they did not see was an insurance policy. The woodpile could not be turned off by a power outage. It could not freeze in a regulator. It could not run empty because a delivery truck could not get through 2 feet of snow on the county road. It sat behind the barn under tarps immune to everything except fire and time, representing 3 months of continuous heating. Rupert had never needed more than 6 weeks in a single calving season. But he stacked 3 months every year because Clem had told him what Heinrich had said and what Heinrich had learned the hard way in Moravia: stack more than you need. You can always burn less. You can never burn what you did not cut. In the autumn of 1977, Clint Darby installed a Resner forced air propane system in Boyd Sheridan's calving barn 1 mile northeast of the Voss place. Boyd was 52 years old, a capable rancher with a modern operation and the particular confidence of a man who had always moved with the technology of his era rather than against it. The installation was an occasion. Clint had done the work on a Thursday, and by Saturday, word had gotten around and a handful of ranchers had stopped by to have a look. Rupert was among them. He stood in Boyd Sheridan's barn and looked at the Resner unit, which was mounted on the wall with clean lines and a thermostat panel and an automatic ignition system that required nothing from the person operating it, except that the propane tank outside was full. Boyd explained how it worked with the satisfaction of a man who has just acquired something that confirms his judgment. Clint stood nearby with his arms folded, the posture of a man watching a demonstration that he has arranged and is pleased with. Rupert looked at the system for a long time without saying anything. Then he asked his one question. What does it need besides propane to run? Clint said, electricity. For the blower fan and the ignition. Rupert nodded. He looked at the unit one more time. Then he thanked Boyd for the look and drove home on the county road. In the November afternoon, the sandhills rolling away on both sides of the road, the same way they had always rolled, patient and indifferent in the way of landscape that has seen everything and forgotten most of it. He went directly to the woodpile. He spent the remainder of that afternoon and the following 2 mornings adding to it. Not frantically, not with any visible urgency. The same pace he always worked, steady and complete, and without wasted motion. When he was finished, the woodpile that had represented 2 months of heating capacity now represented 3. He covered it with fresh tarps, weighted at the edges, and went in for dinner. Marta had been watching from the kitchen window. She had been watching Rupert work for 31 years, and she knew the difference between the work he did because it needed doing and the work he did because something had shifted in his thinking, and the shift required a physical response. She asked him at dinner why he had added to the pile after coming back from Boyd Sheridan's place. He said Boyd's system needs electricity to start. Marta was quiet for a moment. Then she said, so add wood. She did not ask anything else. 31 years of mornings in that house had taught her that when Rupert did something without explaining it, the explanation would eventually become visible, and the waiting was not wasted time, but simply the interval between a decision and its justification. The winter came on through November and December in the ordinary way of Sandhills winters, cold and dry and windy, the temperature dropping below zero several times in January, and the grass on the dunes going the color of old rope. Rupert kept the woodpile covered and the boiler tuned, and the supply of seasoned elm stacked inside the barn at the ready. He checked the water level in the boiler every morning. He listened to the sound of the water in the pipe. He felt the temperature of the iron at the far end of the loop. Everything was as it should be. On the morning of January 12, 1978, Rupert was in the kitchen at 6 o'clock when he checked the barometer that hung on the wall beside the door. He checked it every morning. He had checked it every morning for 31 years. The reading he saw that morning made him set the instrument back on its nail without saying anything. Marta was at the stove. She heard him set it down, and she heard the silence that followed, and she began filling the largest pot she had with water and setting it on the burner. She went to the shelf where the kerosene lamps were kept and made sure they were full. Rupert put on his coat and went outside. The sky to the northwest had the color he recognized, iron gray, dense and deliberate, the kind of sky that had already made its decision and was simply in the process of arriving. The wind was 20 miles an hour at 6 in the morning, which in January in Cherry County was not alarming, but Rupert could feel in it the leading edge of something much larger. There was a pressure in it, a physical weight that the ordinary January wind did not carry. He stood in the yard for a moment and looked northwest and felt the pressure and made his calculations. He went to the barn. He began moving cattle at 9 in the morning, 3 hours earlier than the first forecast would have suggested necessary. He brought in the 12 cows that were closest to calving first, reading them with the same attention he gave the barometer, checking bag development and posture, and the particular restlessness that a cow shows in the 24 hours before labor. Then he brought in 8 more as a precaution, cows that were not yet close, but that the sky told him should not be left outside for whatever was coming. He loaded the firebox at 10 o'clock with a full charge of seasoned elm. Dense wood, slow-burning, high heat, output the kind of wood that would hold a fire for 6 hours without attention. He checked every joint along the 60 feet of pipe, working methodically from the boiler to the far corner of the barn and back, pressing his hand against each connection, feeling for any warmth that might indicate a developing leak. He found nothing. He placed a spare bag of gasket compound and a set of hand tools in the corner nearest the boiler, not because he expected to need them, because a man who expects the unexpected leaves himself the means to address it. At noon, the wind hit 45 miles an hour, sustained with gusts to 60. By 12:30, the sky had delivered on its promise. The snow came not as flakes, but as pellets. Ice-hard granules driven nearly horizontal by the wind, hitting the barn walls with a sound like gravel thrown against tin. Visibility dropped in a matter of minutes. Not low visibility, not poor visibility, zero visibility. The kind of white that was not a color, but an absence, a condition in which the world beyond arm's reach ceased to exist. The temperature inside the Voss calving barn at noon on January 12, 1978, was 42 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature outside was falling toward -18 and had not found its floor yet. 1 mile northeast at the Boyd Sheridan place, the Resner unit was running on its thermostat, maintaining the barn at a steady 40 degrees with no human attention, required the automatic ignition cycling on and off as the temperature dipped below the set point and recovered. It had been running this way without incident for 2 months. It was a good system. Clint Darby had installed it correctly and Boyd had maintained it properly, and the thermostat was functioning exactly as designed. At 2:15 in the afternoon, the main feeder line of the Cherry Todd Electric Cooperative snapped somewhere east of Valentine under the combined weight of ice accumulation and sustained wind that had been building for 6 hours. The crack was audible to anyone within a quarter mile of where it happened, a sound like a rifle shot, followed by the particular silence that follows a sound that cannot be undone. The eastern half of Cherry County went dark. At the Boyd Sheridan place, the Resner unit stopped. The blower fan stopped. The automatic ignition stopped. The thermostat continued to read the temperature accurately and continued to send the signal that would have activated the system, but there was nothing left to receive the signal. The propane tank outside was full. The system was undamaged. It simply had nothing to work with. In the Voss calving barn 1 mile southwest, nothing changed. The boiler had no electrical components. It had no ignition system. It had no blower and no thermostat and no connection to the Cherry Todd Electric Cooperative or any other grid that could fail. It was a cast iron box with a fire in it connected to 60 feet of iron pipe that moved water by the simple physical fact that hot water rises and cool water falls. The fire was burning. The water was moving. The pipe was warm. The 20 cows in the barn were calm in the particular way that cattle are calm when they are warm and fed and not afraid. The temperature inside the Voss barn at 2:15 when the power died 42 degrees. Rupert was in the barn when the lights went out. He had been there since noon, not because he was certain something would fail, but because the sky had told him to be there, and he had learned long ago to listen to that particular instruction. He had a kerosene lamp already lit and hanging from a nail near the boiler. When the overhead light died, the lamp continued burning. He checked the firebox. The elm was at its midpoint, holding a good coal bed, giving off steady heat. He added 2 more pieces to extend the load and closed the door. He checked each of the 20 cows. He checked the water level in the boiler. He looked at the temperature of the iron at the far end of the pipe, pressing his palm flat against it, holding it there, reading the warmth, the way a doctor reads a pulse. Everything was as it should be. Outside, the storm was becoming what it would be remembered as for the rest of the century, one of the 10 worst blizzard events in Nebraska history. A Canadian clipper that had merged with Gulf moisture over western Nebraska and was now depositing 31 inches of snow in 48 hours under wind conditions that sculpted it into drifts 20 feet deep in the draws and valleys where cattle sheltered and stripped other exposed areas down to bare ground. Wind chill -53 degrees Fahrenheit. At -53, exposed flesh freezes in under 2 minutes. Cattle standing in the open begin to lose core temperature within 30 minutes. A calf born wet and unable to stand in those conditions has almost no chance without intervention. At the Sheridan place, Boyd had his backup generator running by 3 o'clock. A 5-kilowatt unit on gasoline enough to run the Resner system and keep the barn heated. He had enough fuel in the tank for 8 hours. He ran it through the afternoon and into the evening, watching the fuel gauge drop with the particular attention of a man who has only one thing keeping his animals alive and can see the level going down. The generator ran out of fuel at 11 o'clock that night. Boyd had reserve fuel in a storage tank behind the machine, shed 50 yards from the barn. He dressed in everything he owned, opened the barn door into the blizzard, and tried to walk those 50 yards. In zero visibility with wind strong enough to knock a standing man sideways, 50 yards is not a distance. It is an abstraction. He lost his orientation within 15 steps. He could not see the shed. He could not see the barn he had just left. He could not see anything except white in every direction. He found his way back to the barn by going to his hands and knees and following the fence wire with his gloved hand, moving by touch in the dark, in the white, until the barn wall found him. The generator sat empty in the yard. The Resner unit went cold. By midnight, the temperature inside Boyd Sheridan's calving barn was falling. In the Voss barn, Rupert set his alarm clock for 2 in the morning and went to the house for dinner. Marta had cooked on the wood stove, which ran on the same principle as everything else in the Voss operation. Fuel, you cut yourself; fire, you built yourself; heat, you understood completely. She had kept the kitchen warm through the afternoon and evening with a steadiness that matched her husband's. Neither of them speaking much, both of them doing the things they knew how to do. Rupert ate. He drank coffee. He sat at the table for 20 minutes and then went to bed. The alarm woke him at 2. He dressed in the dark. He put on his coat and his heavy gloves and took the kerosene lamp from the hook by the door and walked from the house to the barn in the blizzard. The distance was 40 yards. He had made that walk 10,000 times. He counted his steps and kept the wind at his back on the way out and at his face on the way back. And he did not deviate from the line because he knew the line the way he knew the pipe and the firebox and the sound the water made when the circulation was right. He opened the firebox. He read the coals. He added 4 split pieces of elm. He closed the door. He checked the water level. He checked the 20 cows moving slowly down the row, looking at each one with the lamp held low. He found nothing that required his attention. He walked back to the house. 20 minutes. He set the alarm for 6 and went back to sleep. Outside, the storm that had killed the power and frozen the propane regulators and defeated the generators and sent the temperature to -18 was not finished. It had hours of work left to do. It had a county to go through 4,000 head of cattle to account for 42 calving operations, to test against the question that blizzards always ask, did you prepare for me, or did you prepare for the technology that was supposed to protect you from me? In the Voss barn, the boiler asked no questions. It burned. The water moved. The pipe was warm. The cows breathed their slow, warm breath into air that was cold outside the walls and bearable inside them. A heifer in the third stall was showing the early signs of labor, shifting her weight and looking back at her flank with the focused attention of an animal that knows something is about to happen. Rupert would be back at 6. The fire would still be burning when he got there. It had never not been burning when it was needed. Not in 1923 when Heinrich built it. Not through the hard winters of the 30s when Clem was running the place. Not in the 47 calving seasons since Rupert had taken over at age 12 with a piece of split elm in his hand and a father standing behind him saying, load it full close. Right, listen to what the water tells you. The same fire, the same iron, the same water, the same loop of pipe along the same barn walls, the same darkness outside and the same warmth inside, and the same understanding passed from one pair of hands to the next over 55 years that the only technology a man can trust completely is the technology he understands completely. Outside, Cherry County was learning what it did not know. Inside the Voss barn, nothing needed to be learned. Everything that mattered had already been understood long before the storm arrived to test it. The alarm went off at 6 in the morning, and Rupert was already awake. He had been lying in the dark listening to the storm work on the house, the particular sound of wind at sustained velocity against the structure that has been standing long enough to know how to receive it. The house that Clem had built in 1931 from lumber hauled up from Valentine did not shake in the wind. It did not creak dramatically or suggest in any way that it was uncertain about its situation. It absorbed the pressure the way the old things absorb pressure by distributing it across the whole of what they are rather than concentrating it in any one place. Rupert had slept in this house for 31 years. He knew its sounds the way he knew the sounds of the boiler. He was dressed before the alarm finished its first ring. Marta heard him moving in the dark and sat up. She did not ask where he was going. She knew where he was going. She got up and went to the kitchen and had the stove lit and water heating by the time he came back from the first barn check of the morning. This was not a decision she made that morning. It was simply what she had always done, the natural counterpart to what he did. Two people who had organized their life around the same farm for 3 decades, falling into their respective positions without discussion because the positions were simply where they stood. Rupert made the walk to the barn at 6. The storm had not diminished overnight. If anything, it had consolidated itself, found its full commitment to what it was going to be, and was now executing that commitment with the methodical thoroughness of something that does not get tired. The wind was sustained at 50 miles an hour. The temperature had dropped to -14. The snow was still coming, still horizontal, still the hard ice pellet variety that stung any exposed skin. It found and built up on surfaces in ways that ordinary snow did not. Rupert walked the 40 yards to the barn, counting his steps and feeling the wind and keeping himself oriented by the angle of the pressure against his body. He opened the barn door and pulled it shut behind him. The temperature inside was 38 degrees. He stood for a moment and let that number settle in him. 38 degrees inside, -14 outside and falling. A differential of more than 50 degrees maintained through the night by a cast iron firebox and 60 feet of pipe, and the physical properties of hot water moving through a closed loop. The boiler had been burning for 18 hours. It had asked for nothing in that time, except the wood Rupert had given it at 2 in the morning, and it had converted that wood into heat, the same way it had converted wood into heat since 1923, without drama, without variation, without any of the preconditions that modern systems required in order to function. He opened the firebox. The coal bed was deep and red exactly where it should be after 4 hours on a full load of elm. He raked the coals forward, added 4 more pieces, closed the door. He checked the water level through the sight glass, which showed full. He pressed his palm against the return pipe where it entered the boiler to confirm the circulation was flowing. The pipe was warm coming in and hot going out. Everything was correct. He moved down the row of cows. The heifer that had been showing early labor signs at midnight had calved sometime in the small hours of the morning. The calf was dry and standing pressed against its mother's flank, already nursing with the focused intensity of a newborn that has gotten past the first and hardest part of being alive. Rupert ran his hand along the calf's back, feeling the warmth of it, the solid, living warmth of an animal that had been born in a heated space and had not had to spend any of its first hours fighting cold instead of learning to breathe and stand and eat. He recorded the birth in the small notebook he kept in his coat pocket. Date time estimated, calf weight estimated condition. Then he went back to the house. He ate breakfast at the kitchen table while Marta refilled his coffee twice without being asked. Outside the window, the storm was a solid white condition that had replaced the world. There was no distance visible in any direction. The barn was 40 yards from the kitchen window, and Rupert could not see it. He thought about Boyd Sheridan. He thought about the 50 yards between Boyd's barn and Boyd's machine shed and the fuel tank that was sitting behind that shed in the middle of that storm. He thought about the Resner unit and the propane tank and the thermostat that was still accurately measuring the temperature in a barn that had nothing left to heat it. He thought about the cows in that barn and what the night had done to the temperature inside it and what the next 12 hours would do if nothing changed. There was nothing Rupert could do about Boyd Sheridan's barn. The county road between the two properties was under 6 feet of drifted snow. A vehicle could not pass. A man on foot could try the 1.5 in -53-degree wind chill and might make it if he stayed oriented and kept moving and did not fall. But the probability was not the kind Rupert would have accepted under any framing he could put on it. He knew this. He accepted it the way he accepted weather, as a condition that existed independently of his preferences and required him to work within it rather than against it. What he could do was keep his own barn burning. He went back at 10. The temperature had held at 38. He loaded the firebox again, checked the cows, noted that 2 more were showing early labor signs. He brought in 2 additional cows from the outside lot, working through the storm in the 40 yards of white between the barn and the lot gate, moving the animals by touch and voice, because neither he nor they could see clearly enough to navigate by sight. He got them in. He got himself in. He checked the boiler and went back to the house. This was what the day was. Not heroic in the way that events are heroic in stories with a single dramatic moment of decision. It was heroic in the way that most real things are heroic, through repetition, through showing up at the appointed time regardless of the conditions, through doing the small correct thing at 6 and at 10 and at 2 and at 6 and at 10 until the small correct things accumulated into an outcome that would not have existed without them. Across Cherry County, the accumulation was running in the other direction. At the Merle Hagen operation 4 miles west, the propane heater had died with the power at 2:15 the previous afternoon, and Merle had no backup generator. He had moved his pregnant cows into the barn before the storm, which was the right decision, but the barn was designed to be heated, and without heat, it was simply a structure that blocked the wind without addressing the cold. By midnight, the temperature inside was 14 degrees. By 6 in the morning, it was 8. Merle sat in his truck with the engine running, parked inside the barn door, trying to direct the exhaust heat toward the cattle. It was not enough. The cab of a pickup truck running at idle in an 8-degree barn generates a cone of warm air that dissipates within 10 feet. The first calf died at 4 in the morning. Born wet into air that was 8 degrees above zero, unable to generate enough body heat to compensate for the rate at which the cold was taking it. Merle found it when he checked at 4, lying on the concrete floor, already stiff. He carried it out and laid it along the wall and went back in and sat in his truck and tried to think of what else he could do. There was nothing else he could do. He lost 19 calves in the first 48 hours. At the operation near Merriman, 30 miles northeast, a rancher named Aldous Frick had run his generator through Thursday night and into Friday morning. But the fuel line froze at 8 a.m. Friday, and the generator stopped, and the barn went cold, and 40 head of cattle drifted out of a broken gate into the storm and found their way into a draw east of the barn, and the snow filled in over them. He found them Saturday morning when the wind dropped enough to see across the yard. 107 head, all dead. The Cherry Todd Electric Cooperative reported Friday morning that the repair to the main feeder line would require parts that could not be delivered until the roads were passable, and the roads would not be passable until the storm broke, and the storm was not going to break until sometime on Monday. 42 ranching operations in eastern Cherry County had relied on electric ignition for their propane systems. 38 of them had no heat. In the Voss calving barn, Rupert loaded the firebox at 2 in the afternoon. 38 degrees inside, -16 outside. The differential had grown by 2 degrees as the exterior temperature continued to fall. The boiler was compensating, running a slightly hotter fire than it had in the morning, because the wood Rupert had loaded at noon was elm, rather than cottonwood, denser and slower to burn, and it was producing more BTU per log than the cottonwood would have. Rupert had made this choice deliberately, the same way he made all his choices about the fire, by reading what the system was telling him and responding to the information rather than to a fixed schedule. He delivered a second calf that afternoon. Another heifer, her first a difficult birth that took 40 minutes of patient work and left both Rupert and the cow exhausted. But the calf was alive. The calf was warm. The calf stood within 30 minutes of birth and found the teat within the hour. This was what the heated barn made possible. Not comfort, survival. The margin between a calf born at 38 degrees and a calf born at 8 degrees was the margin between life and death, and that margin was maintained by an old cast-iron box burning seasoned elm and the man who fed it every 4 hours. At 6 in the evening, Rupert was in the barn when he heard the wind shift. Not diminish, shift. The pressure against the north wall of the barn that had been constant since noon changed its angle slightly, coming more from the northwest now, which meant the storm was rotating, which meant it was deepening rather than passing. He listened to this for a moment and then loaded the firebox with 2 extra pieces of cedar, which burned hotter than elm and would maintain the temperature through the night without requiring him to shorten his interval. He checked the water level, checked the cows, wrote in his notebook, and went to the house. Marta had dinner ready. They ate together at the kitchen table in the light of the kerosene lamp, because the electricity had been out since Thursday afternoon and showed no sign of returning. The lamp gave the kitchen the same quality of light it had had when Clem and his wife had eaten at this table in the 1930s, a warm and bounded light that made the darkness outside feel more absolute, but also made the inside feel more deliberate, more chosen. Marta did not speak much during dinner. Neither did Rupert. There was nothing that needed to be said. They both knew what the next several days required, and they were both already doing it. At 10, Rupert made the barn check. He carried the kerosene lamp and counted his steps in the storm 40 yards to the barn door and pulled it open and went in. He went directly to the boiler. He set the lamp on the shelf above it and opened the firebox to read the coals, and then he saw it. At the third joint from the boiler, where the supply pipe made its turn along the north wall, there was a thread of vapor catching the lamplight, thin as a hair. Rising from the joint where the iron collar met the pipe, dissipating immediately in the barn air, but unmistakably there a continuous thread that had not been there at 6. Rupert crouched and put his face close to the joint. The vapor was steam, hot water from the pipe finding the gap in the collar and escaping as vapor before it could run. The leak was small. At this rate, it would not drain the system for hours. But the system held 30 gallons, and if the leak grew as leaks in hot pressurized pipe tend to grow, the water level would drop below the point where the circulation could be maintained, and the boiler would run dry, and a cast iron boiler run dry on a full fire would crack. He sat back on his heels for a moment and looked at the joint. He had inspected every joint that morning. This one had been solid. The storm had been working on the barn all day, and the barn had flexed in the sustained wind, not dramatically the way old well-built structures flex, but enough. Enough to open a gap in a joint that had been sealed for years. He went to the corner where he had placed the bag of gasket compound on Thursday morning when he had stocked the barn for the storm. He brought it back to the joint and opened it. The compound was thick and cold, and he worked it with his bare hands until it was pliable, which took several minutes in the barn air, his hands going numb and then aching with the manipulation. He went back to the house. Marta was still up. She looked at his face when he came in and did not ask. He said, "There is a joint leaking on the north run. I need you to hold the lamp." She put on her coat. They went together into the storm, Marta with the lamp and Rupert with a compound and his tools in a canvas bag over his shoulder, walking the 40 yards side by side with the wind trying to push them off the line, and neither of them allowing it. Marta had been making this walk for 31 years. She knew the 40 yards the same way Rupert knew them by feel and count and the angle of the wind. Inside the barn, they went to the joint. Marta held the lamp steady at the angle that gave Rupert the best light on the collar, holding it without moving her arm, extended her position, absolutely stable, while Rupert worked the compound into the gap with his fingers and then compressed it with the small tool he had brought. The work required two hands and close attention and the specific patience of a person who understands that doing a thing correctly once is different from doing a thing quickly twice. Rupert worked for 40 minutes. When he was satisfied, he held the lamp himself and looked at the joint from every angle the lamp could illuminate. The thread of vapor was gone. He pressed his fingers around the collar and felt nothing. No warmth, no moisture. He straightened up and Marta took the lamp back. They stood together in the barn for a moment. Outside, the storm was in full operation, wind and cold, and the sound of snow against the tin roof, a continuous percussion that had not stopped since Thursday noon. Inside the barn, the boiler was burning. The pipe was warm. The cows were breathing. Two newborn calves were asleep in the straw beside their mothers. Marta looked at the boiler for a moment. Then she looked at her husband. He did not say anything. There was nothing that needed to be said. They walked back to the house together in the dark and the cold and went to bed. Rupert loaded the firebox at 2 in the morning and found the joint sound. He loaded it again at 6 on Saturday morning and found the joint sound. The temperature inside the barn was 37 degrees. Outside, it was -18. The storm was in its third day. Across the county, the situation had passed through crisis and into something that did not have a good name because it was beyond the acute phase and into the sustained one. The phase where the question was no longer whether people would lose cattle, but how many. Cherry County Extension had reached Valentine by phone and reported that calf mortality countywide was running above 12% compared to the seasonal average of 3%. The number would go higher before it went lower. The county roads were impassable. The National Guard had been requested from Lincoln. The request was under consideration. On Saturday afternoon, Rupert was in the barn at the 2 o'clock check when he heard the door. It did not open the way a barn door opens when the wind catches it and pulls it. It opened the way a door opens when someone on the other side has been working against resistance for some distance and has finally reached the handle and used the last of what they had to pull it open. A heavy opening, deliberate with the weight of effort behind it. Boyd Sheridan came through the door. Rupert saw him and did not move immediately because what he saw required a moment to assemble into something his mind could accept as a single image. Boyd was wearing everything he owned, every layer face wrapped, except for the eyes, and even the exposed skin around the eyes was red and cracked in a way that indicated frostbite had been working on it. His boots were packed with snow that had gotten inside them and refrozen. His gloves, heavy leather work gloves that were adequate for ordinary cold, had frozen stiff around the shape of his hands. He was standing with his legs slightly apart, the stance of a man who has been moving for a long time and is not certain his legs will continue. He was holding something in his arms, a calf, 60, maybe 70 pounds. A black baldy, 3 days old, its head hanging to the side with the specific limpness of an animal that has surrendered the effort of holding itself upright. Its ears were pale at the tips. Its tail was pale, the pale of tissue that has been cold long enough to stop fighting. Boyd did not say a word when he came in. He did not need to. The distance he had covered to get here, and the thing he was carrying said everything that could be said about what the past 36 hours had been on his operation. Rupert was already moving. He pointed to the far corner of the barn, where the pipe made its turn, and the radiant heat was strongest, where the barn's warmth pooled against the wall in the way heat pools against surfaces. Boyd walked to the corner and lowered the calf onto the straw that Rupert had spread there, kneeling with the deliberateness of a man whose knees have used up most of their available cooperation for the day. The calf lay on its side. Its breathing was shallow and irregular. Its body temperature, if anyone had measured it, was probably somewhere between 85 and 88 degrees. The normal temperature for a calf is 101.5. Below 94 is serious hypothermia. Below 86, the heart begins to make decisions that are difficult to reverse. Rupert went to the house. He came back in 4 minutes with the largest pot Marta had filled with water. She had kept hot on the wood stove since morning, knowing without being told that hot water was a thing that might be needed, and that a stove that did not require electricity could provide it regardless of what the grid was doing. They worked without speaking, Rupert and Boyd rubbing the calf's legs and belly with rough, dry burlap to stimulate circulation, working toward the body core, keeping the animal's head elevated. Marta appeared at the barn door 20 minutes after Rupert had gone to the house for the water. She had brought a horse blanket. She spread it over the calf from the shoulders back, leaving the head clear, tucking the edges down into the straw to trap what warmth the animal was beginning to generate. The pipe along the wall radiated its steady, measured heat into the corner where the calf lay. Not a blast of forced air, not a concentrated source that would warm the surface and leave the core cold. Radiant heat, the kind that penetrates, the kind that warms a thing through, rather than at its surface the kind that Heinrich Voss had designed into the system in 1923, because he had grown up in a place where the difference between those two kinds of warmth was the difference between an animal that lived and one that did not. An hour passed. The calf shivered. Boyd Sheridan, sitting on a hay bale 3 feet away, saw it and straightened up from the posture he had been holding, the posture of a man watching something he cannot control and is afraid to hope about. Shivering was good. Shivering meant the body was trying. The muscles were attempting to generate heat through motion, which meant the core temperature had risen enough for the body to reinvest energy in its own survival, rather than simply maintaining minimum function. Another hour. The calf blinked. Its head came up slightly, then settled, then came up again, and stayed. At the 3-hour mark, it tried to stand. The attempt was not successful. The legs went out sideways, and the calf sank back onto the straw with the ungainly collapse of a creature whose coordination has not yet caught up with its intentions. But the intention was there. The intention was unmistakably there. Rupert steadied the calf's hindquarters on the second attempt, and the calf stood. Wobbly, uncertain, its weight shifting in all directions as it recalibrated, but upright, alive, present in the barn, in a way it had not been when Boyd had carried it through the door 2.5 hours earlier. Boyd looked at the calf for a long time. He looked at the pipe along the wall, warm and unvarying in its warmth, the same temperature it had been all day, and all the previous day, and all the day before that. He looked at the boiler in the corner, the old cast-iron box with its simple firebox and its sight glass and its 60 feet of iron pipe, the system that had no automatic ignition and no thermostat and no connection to any grid that could fail. He said, "I was carrying a dead calf, Rupert. I was certain of it before I got to your door. Your barn brought it back." Rupert opened the firebox and added 2 pieces of elm. He watched the fire catch on the new wood for a moment before he spoke. "It was not the barn," he said. "It was the fire. The same fire my grandfather built when this barn was new." Boyd was quiet. "How many have you lost?" Rupert asked. 11 calves, 4 cows. The cows went down in the lot Thursday night. They drifted against the fence and the snow came in over them." "I am sorry." Boyd looked at the calf, which was now leaning against Rupert's leg with its eyes half open, breathing with a regularity it had not had when it came in. One ear was pale at the tip, the frostbite that had begun before Boyd found it, and that would cost the calf the top inch of that ear permanently. The tail had lost feeling and would be shortened. These were the marks the storm would leave on this animal for the rest of its life. They were marks of survival. The calf had earned them. Boyd said, "I had the best system Clint Darby sells, the best ignition, the best thermostat, the biggest BTU rating he carries. It worked perfectly for 2 months. And then the power went out for 45 minutes and it became an expensive piece of cold metal in a coal barn. Rupert did not say anything. He had said what he had to say on this subject years ago at co-ops and in conversation, and by example, and nothing that happened in the next 48 hours would require him to say it again. Boyd Sheridan did not need Rupert to explain to him what had happened. He had walked a mile and a half in negative 53-degree wind chill carrying a dying calf. He understood what had happened. Boyd stayed in the barn for the rest of the afternoon. He was in no condition to walk back. His feet needed to be checked for frostbite, and his hands needed to be warmed, and his body needed the rest that it had earned by doing what it had done. Marta brought food from the house. Rupert made the 6 o'clock barn check with Boyd sitting on a hay bale watching, and Boyd watched Rupert go through the procedure that he went through every 4 hours, the reading of the coals, the adding of wood, the checking of the water level, the pressing of the palm against the return pipe, the slow walk down the row of cows. It took 20 minutes. Boyd watched and did not say anything. That evening, 2 more ranchers arrived, not together, separately from different directions, both of them having heard on battery-powered radios that the Voss barn was the only heated calving operation in eastern Cherry County still functioning. One came from 2 miles north on foot, leading a cow that had calved that morning in an unheated barn and whose calf was hypothermic. The other came from the east driving a tractor because his truck could not get through the drifts with 2 calves in the loader bucket, wrapped in horse blankets. Rupert opened the barn door each time. He did not say much. He showed them where to put the animals and he checked the animals and he told them what to watch for and he went back to monitoring the fire. The barn was filling with the combined warmth and breath of cattle from 4 different operations, all of them alive, because the Voss place had heat, and the Voss place had heat because a man had loaded a firebox at 10 in the morning, and 2 in the afternoon, and 6 in the evening, and 10 at night and 2 in the morning without interruption for 3 days. The woodpile behind the barn was shrinking. Rupert had moved to checking it every morning, not because he was worried, but because he believed in knowing where you stood. After 3 days of continuous operation, the pile had lost approximately 1 cord. At the current rate, the remaining wood would carry the operation through 2 more full weeks without rationing. He was not going to need to ration. He was not going to run out. He had cut and stacked 3 months of wood because Clem had told him to cut and stack 3 months. And Clem had told him because Heinrich had said that the thing you cannot burn is the thing you did not cut, and Heinrich had known this the way he knew everything about cold, from living inside it long enough to understand that preparation was not pessimism, but arithmetic. Saturday night, Rupert set the alarm for 2 and slept. Marta lay beside him in the dark and listened to the storm work on the house and felt the particular quality of the dark that surrounds a man who has done what needed doing and is sleeping because sleep is what is needed now. Not the dark of exhaustion, the dark of a plow being done correctly in stages without drama, the way the boiler did its job and the woodpile did its job, and the pipe along the barn wall did its job steadily and without requiring acknowledgement. She had not been afraid. Not at 2 in the morning when Rupert went to the barn in the storm. Not when she walked the 40 yards herself in the dark to hold the lamp while he fixed the joint. Not when Boyd Sheridan appeared in the door with a dying calf. She had not been afraid because fear is the response to something you did not see coming, and Marta Voss had been watching her husband prepare for exactly this kind of storm for 31 years. She had watched him add to the woodpile after every conversation with Clint Darby. She had watched him stock the barn with tools and compound before the first hard freeze every November. She had watched him cut elm instead of cottonwood in October because elm burned hotter in the deep cold months, were what the barn needed the wood for. She had not been afraid because Rupert had not left anything to chance. This was not luck. Luck is what you have when the thing you did not prepare for does not happen. What the Voss barn had was not luck. It was the accumulated result of every correct decision made by every person who had ever been responsible for this operation, from Heinrich, ordering cast iron plates from an Omaha foundry in 1923, to Clem teaching a 12-year-old boy how to load a firebox, to Rupert adding 1 more row to a woodpile on a November afternoon after asking 1 question about a propane system and getting an answer that told him everything he needed to know. The storm went on through Sunday. The boiler went on through Sunday. Rupert made his checks at 2 and 6 and 10, and 2 and 6 and 10 and 2 7 times in 24 hours each. Check. 20 minutes each check, the same sequence. Each check returning the same result. The fire was burning. The water was moving. The barn was warm. The animals were alive. By Sunday evening, the Voss calving barn held 20 cows from the Voss operation and 11 calves from 4 neighboring ranches. The boiler had been burning continuously for 72 hours. The woodpile had lost approximately 2.5 cords. There was enough remaining for another 10 days at the current rate. Not one animal on the Voss operation had been lost. Outside, the storm was still running its arithmetic. More than 1,200 calves dead across Cherry County. 43 operations had reported losses. The county extension office was fielding calls around the clock on the one phone line that was still functioning. The economic damage was being calculated in numbers that would take weeks to confirm, and that would represent, when they were confirmed, the worst single-event livestock loss in Cherry County since 1949. In the Voss barn, Rupert checked the joint on the north run at each of his visits and found it sound every time. The compound had held. He had known it would hold. He had put it in correctly and given it the time it needed to set, and it had done what it was made to do. This was the nature of the things Rupert relied on. They did what they were made to do when they were correctly maintained and correctly operated by a person who understood them. They did not require anything beyond that understanding. They did not require the grid or the propane truck or the automatic ignition or the thermostat signal to reach a receiver that was ready to act on it. They required wood and fire and a man who got up every 4 hours. That was all. That had always been all. The storm would break on Monday. The roads would clear by Wednesday. The losses would be counted and the numbers would be reported, and Cherry County would begin the long process of accounting for what had happened to it in 4 days in January of 1978. Some operations would recover, some would not. Some families that had ranched this ground for generations would find when the accounting was done that what they had lost in those 4 days was more than could be replaced in the time they had left to replace it. The Voss operation would not be among them, but Monday was still a day away. Sunday night was still Sunday night, and Sunday night the boiler was burning and the pipe was warm, and the calves from 4 ranches were sleeping in the straw in a barn that smelled of cattle and hay and wood smoke, and the particular smell that Rupert had known since he was 12 years old. The smell of a heated space in the middle of a cold world. The smell that Heinrich had designed into this barn in 1923 because he had come from a place where you understood without being told that warmth is not a comfort. It is a decision made before the storm comes with wood and iron, and the willingness to get up in the dark and remade every 4 hours for as long as the storm lasts. Rupert set his alarm for 2 and went to sleep. The storm broke on Monday, the 16th of January. It did not break dramatically. It did not announce itself with a change in the wind or a lifting of the sky or any of the visible signs that weather makes when it decides to move on. It simply stopped. The sustained wind that had been running at 45 miles an hour or better since Thursday noon dropped over the course of 2 hours on Monday morning to something that was merely cold rather than lethal, and the snow that had been coming in horizontal sheets settled into a brief light fall and then stopped entirely, and for the first time in 4 days, Cherry County could see itself. What it saw was considerable. The drifts in the draws were 12 to 20 feet deep, packed hard enough to walk on if you distributed your weight. The county roads were buried under 6 feet in the low spots and scoured down to bare gravel on the exposed ridges where the wind had not allowed anything to settle. Fence lines had disappeared under the accumulation, the posts still standing, but invisible, the wire buried. The farmsteads and ranch buildings that were visible from the roads looked smaller than they had on Thursday morning, the drifts having built up against their walls and around their outbuildings, and in some cases over their equipment, in ways that would take days of serious work to address. The sky on Monday morning was the particular blue that Nebraska produces after a serious winter storm, a blue so clean and absolute that it seemed to be making a statement about what the preceding days had been, a clarity that arrived by contrast. The sun was out and the temperature was -6, and the snow that had fallen 31 inches of it in 4 days reflected the sun in a way that required a man to shade his eyes to look across his own fields. Rupert Voss stood in the doorway of his calving barn at 6 on Monday morning and looked at this sky for a moment before he went in to check the fire. The boiler had been burning continuously for 96 hours. He opened the firebox and found a coal bed that had the particular depth and color of a fire that has been correctly managed for a long time. Not the shallow gray ash of a fire that has been allowed to run down too far and been rebuilt from scratch, but the deep red coal bed of a fire that has been fed at the right intervals with the right wood in the right quantities. He raked it forward and added 4 pieces of elm and closed the door. He checked the water level. He checked the joint on the north run. He walked down the row of cattle. 11 calves from neighboring operations were in the barn, some nursing, some sleeping in the straw. The ones that had come in most recently still showing the pale ear tips and shortened tails that were the storm's permanent signature on them. All of them alive. All of them past the threshold where the cold could still claim them. His own 20 cows had delivered 8 calves during the 4 days of the storm. All 8 were alive. The operation had gone into the storm with 20 cows in the barn and had come out with 20 kids and 8 new calves and not a single loss. Rupert recorded this in his notebook in the same handwriting he used to record everything small and precise and without emphasis because the facts did not require emphasis. They were what they were. He went back to the house for breakfast. The county road was passable by Wednesday. The county grader came through Tuesday afternoon and cut a single lane through the worst of the drifts, enough for vehicles to get through if they went carefully, and did not meet anything coming the other direction in the narrow places. By Wednesday morning, Rupert was able to drive into Valentine for supplies the first time since the previous Thursday, and he made the trip methodically, buying what was needed and nothing else, and came back and unloaded and went to check the fire. The word had gotten out before the roads opened. It had traveled the way information travels in sparsely populated country on battery-powered radios, and the one telephone line that had stayed functional through the storm, passing from ranch to ranch through the particular efficiency of people who understand that in isolated places, information about survival is not gossip but necessity. By Monday afternoon, everyone in eastern Cherry County who had a radio knew that the Voss operation had not lost an animal. By Tuesday, the story of Boyd Sheridan's walk with the calf had attached itself to this fact and was traveling with it. By Wednesday, when the roads opened, it had reached Valentine. On Thursday morning, the truck from Valentine turned onto the county road and made its way to the Voss place. Rupert was in the machine shed when he heard it come down the lane. He came out and saw the truck and saw the man who got out of it and recognized Clint Darby before Clint had fully closed the door. Clint was wearing a heavy coat and his good boots, not his work boots, and he was not carrying a catalog or a product sheet or anything that could be interpreted as a sales call. He looked like a man who had driven somewhere because he needed to see something with his own eyes. Rupert waited. Clint walked to where Rupert was standing and they shook hands, and Clint looked at the barn and then back at Rupert, and Rupert could see in his face the specific expression of a man who has been in a business for 30 years and has just watched that business demonstrate a limitation he had not fully accounted for. Rupert opened the barn door and they went in. The boiler was still running. Rupert had not let it go out since January 12th. 6 days of continuous operation, the fire rebuilt from the same coal bed, maintained at the same steady temperature, producing the same steady heat through the same 60 feet of iron pipe. The cast iron of the firebox was warm to the touch in the way that iron is warm when it has been hot for a long time, not the surface warmth of something recently heated, but the deep warmth of something that has absorbed heat into its substance over days. Clint stood in front of the boiler and looked at it for a long time. He looked at the pipe along the walls. He looked at the calves in the straw. He looked at the water level sight glass in the return pipe in the firebox door and the stack of split elm stacked against the far wall, diminished now but still representing several days of operation. Then he said, "I told you it would crack." "It did not crack," Rupert said. "I told you propane was the future. It was the future until Thursday at 2:15. Then it was a full tank connected to a dead system in a coal barn." Clint was quiet for a moment. He put his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the floor of the barn and looked up at the boiler again. "I had 42 customers in this county," he said. 38 of them lost heat, I know. "How many animals did you lose?" "None." Clint absorbed this in the way a man absorbs a number that he already knew was coming, but that lands differently when it is said out loud in the specific place where it happened. "What do I tell them?" he said. "My customers." What do I tell the people who bought my systems and lost their calves? Rupert opened the firebox and added 2 pieces of elm. He watched the fire settle around the new wood for a moment, the way it always settled, finding the fuel and committing to it, and then he spoke. Tell them the truth, he said. Tell them propane works when the power works. Tell them your thermostat works when the grid is running and your ignition fires when the electricity is there to fire it. Tell them that a system with 4 components fails when any one of those components fails. And in a storm like this one, all 4 components can fail inside of an afternoon. He closed the firebox door. And tell them that when the grid goes down and the propane freezes in the regulator and the generator runs out of fuel, the only heat that does not fail is the heat a man makes with his own hands from fuel he cut and stacked and covered before the snow came. Not the heat someone delivers to his tank by truck. Not the heat a thermostat controls on his behalf. The heat he builds himself from material he controls completely. Clint stood with his hands in his pockets and listened to this. His grandfather built this boiler because he came from a place where winter killed people, Rupert said. Not cattle, people. He knew that the only thing you can trust completely is the thing you understand completely. He understood fire. He understood iron. He understood water moving through a pipe by heat. 3 things. When everything else in this county stopped working, those 3 things kept working. They kept working because they do not have a 4th component that can fail. Clint looked at the boiler. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that has just explained itself to him in terms that cannot be argued with. He left without saying much else. He drove back to Valentine and sat in his office above the heating supply store on Main Street and looked at his customer list, 42 names in eastern Cherry County, 38 of them ranchers who had called him since Monday, reporting losses. He looked at the product catalogs on his desk, the Resner forced air units, and the thermostat systems, and the automatic ignition components that he had been selling for 20 years. He thought about what Rupert had said. 3 things. Fire, iron, water. He thought about the pipe along the barn wall, radiating its steady measured heat from a fire that a 92-year-old man had designed in Moravia before he crossed an ocean, and that a 68-year-old man had maintained through 4 days of the worst blizzard in 30 years by the simple method of getting up every 4 hours and adding wood. That summer, Clint Darby added a line to his product catalog. Cast iron wood-fired hydronic heating systems designed for agricultural buildings suitable for use as primary heat or emergency backup. He installed 14 of them in Cherry County calving barns before the first frost of 1978. He did not make an announcement about the new product line or explain to anyone why he had added it. He simply added it and installed it when people asked and gave them the same straightforward account of how it worked that Rupert had given him in the barn on Thursday morning. Everyone in Cherry County already knew where the idea had come from. Clint did not need to say. The accounting of the storm took weeks to complete. Cherry County Extension compiled the final numbers through February and issued its report in March. Total livestock losses across the county, more than 4,000 head of cattle, calves, cows, and yearlings. Economic impact at 1978 prices, approximately $2 million. Calf mortality for the calving season, 14% compared to the seasonal average of 3. 43 operations had reported significant losses. Some had lost 10% of their herds. Some had lost more. Not one of those 43 operations had been using a wood-fired heating system. The Voss operation was not mentioned by name in the extension report, but everyone who read it knew which operation had not reported losses and why. The story had completed its circulation through Cherry County by the time the roads had been clear for a week. Boyd Sheridan had told it himself with the particular honesty of a man who has been on the wrong side of something and is not interested in pretending otherwise. He told it at the co-op and at the feed store and at the Valentine Diner where ranchers gathered on Saturday mornings, and he told it the same way each time without embellishment and without the defensive hedging that people sometimes add to stories about their own mistakes. He had bought the best system available. The system had worked perfectly until the power went out. The power had been out for 4 days. His barn had been cold for 4 days. He had lost 11 calves and 4 cows. He had carried a dying calf 1.5 miles in a blizzard to the only barn in the county that still had heat. The only barn that still had heat was the one with the 55-year-old cast iron boiler that Clint Darby had been calling a museum piece for 15 years. That was the story. Boyd told it straight. Rupert did not tell it at all. He did not go to the co-op and did not seek out conversations about what had happened on his operation during the storm. When people asked him directly, he answered their questions honestly and completely, and then went back to whatever work he had been doing before they asked. The fire had kept the animals alive. He had kept the fire burning. This was what he had always done and what he expected to always do, and the fact that the particular winter of 1978 had demonstrated the value of this approach in dramatic terms did not change the approach or require commentary. He tended the boiler through the remainder of the calving season, which ran into March. He delivered 12 more calves after the storm, all of them alive and all of them benefiting from the 38-degree interior that the boiler maintained, regardless of what the exterior temperature did. When the last cow had calved and the season was finished and the nights were warm enough that the barn did not need supplemental heat, he let the fire go out for the first time since January 12th. He cleaned the firebox. He checked the pipe. He filled the water jacket and checked the level. He noted the condition of the joint on the north run, which the compound had held through the remainder of the season without developing any further movement. He wrote all of this in his notebook. Then he went to the woodpile. The storm had used approximately 3 cords over 4 days of continuous operation. What remained was more than adequate for the following season. But Rupert began the summer cutting anyway the same 2 weeks in July, the same methodology, the same 4 rows behind the barn. He brought the pile back to 3 months of capacity and covered it with fresh tarps, weighted at the edges, and went to the other work of summer. Gareth, his son, was 40 years old in 1978. He had grown up on this operation and knew the boiler the way Rupert knew it, from decades of contact rather than from instruction, though. Rupert had instructed him the same way Clem had instructed Rupert, by putting him in front of the firebox at an age young enough that the knowledge became part of how he understood the world, rather than something added to an understanding already formed by other experiences. Gareth had loaded that firebox at 12. He had maintained it through calving seasons when Rupert was away or ill. He knew the sound of the water in the pipe and the feel of the iron and the smell of the smoke. After the storm of 1978, Gareth did not say much to his father about what had happened. There was not a great deal that needed to be said between them on the subject. The boiler had worked because it was correctly designed and correctly maintained and correctly supplied with fuel. It had been correctly designed by Heinrich and correctly maintained by Clem and Rupert, and correctly supplied with fuel by the woodpile that every neighbor in the county had been making jokes about for a decade. These were not revelations. They were confirmations of things that Gareth had understood since he was old enough to carry a piece of split elm. What Gareth did after the storm was add a row to the woodpile, not because his father told him to, because the arithmetic of it was clear to him in a way that it had always been clear to him, and that the storm had made clearer to him still. You could always burn less than you had cut. You could never burn what you had not cut. This was not a metaphor. It was a description of how wood and fire and time worked in the physical world, and the physical world had just demonstrated it comprehensively. Rupert ranched the 480 acres on County Road T55 until 1989. He was 79 years old when he handed the operation to Gareth, and the handing over was done in the way that he did everything methodically and completely, with a full accounting of every component of the operation and its current condition, and the maintenance schedule that had kept it in that condition. The boiler was 66 years old when Gareth took it over. The original iron pipe was still in place. The firebox had been relined twice, once in 1951 and once in 1968. The system was in the condition that it was always in, which was to say the condition of something that had been correctly maintained by people who understood it. Rupert said one thing when he handed over the operation. The woodpile does not go below 2 months. Not in September, not in October, not in November. 2 months minimum before the first freeze. That is not a suggestion. Gareth said he understood. He did understand. He had always understood. He ran the operation the way Rupert had run it and the way Clem had run it before that, with the boiler at the center of every calving season and the woodpile replenished every summer and the fire maintained every 4 hours through every night of every calving season from November through March. The boiler ran through the 1990s and into the new century, accumulating its decades the way old iron accumulates them slowly and without complaint, its fundamental function unchanged from the day Heinrich had lit the first fire in it in 1923. Rupert died in January of 2003. He was 93 years old. His funeral was at the Catholic Church in Valentine on a Thursday morning, and the attendance was larger than the church had expected. Ranchers came from across Cherry County, and from outside it, some of them people who had not known Rupert personally, but who had heard the story of the blizzard of 1978, and who understood what the story meant in the language of people who lived where the weather was capable of ending a family operation in a single event. Boyd Sheridan was there. He was 77 years old, and he drove himself from his place northeast of Valentine on roads that were clear and dry a January morning that was cold but not dangerous. He sat in the back of the church with his hat in his hands and did not speak to many people, but was present in the particular way of a man who owes a debt that cannot be repaid because the person it is owed to has died, and the debt therefore becomes something else, something closer to a permanent understanding. Gareth spoke at the service. He was 65 years old, gray-haired, a rancher who had been running the Voss operation for 14 years and who carried himself with the particular quality of a person who has spent his life doing physical work that has a clear and daily relationship to results. He stood at the front of the church, and he did not speak from notes because his father had not spoken from notes when he had something to say, and Gareth had learned this from his father the same way he had learned everything from his father, by watching the form of things alongside the substance. He said that Rupert Voss had been offered modern heating systems every year for 15 years by a man who genuinely believed he was offering something better. He said his father had declined every time. He said the people who knew his father had called him stubborn and backward and behind the times, and he said that the blizzard of 1978 had addressed those descriptions in terms that did not require a response. He said that his father had never claimed his boiler was better than propane in the ordinary meaning of better. He did not claim it produced more BTU or cost less to operate or required less attention. It required more attention. It required a man to get up at 2 in the morning in January, which propane did not require, and it required 2 weeks of work every summer cutting and splitting and stacking wood, which propane did not require. And it required a man to understand the system completely so that when something went wrong, he could fix it himself, which propane did not require because propane systems were designed to be fixed by someone else. What it did not require, Gareth had said, was anything that could fail without warning in a blizzard and leave a barn full of pregnant cows without heat for 4 days. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said my father prepared for the worst winter he had ever seen before it arrived, and when it arrived, he was ready for it, and 200 head of cattle on his operations survived it without a single loss, and 11 calves from 4 neighboring operations survived it because his barn was the only heated building in the county that the storm could not shut down. He did not do anything miraculous. He cut wood, and he built fires, and he got up every 4 hours. That was all he did. He did it for 60 years on this ground, and he died here, and the boiler is still in the barn. Boyd Sheridan looked at his hat in his hands during this last part of what Gareth said. He looked at it for a long time. After the service, after the people had said what people say and made their way back to their vehicles and out of the parking lot and onto the county roads that ran away in all directions through the flat winter grass of Cherry County, Gareth found a moment alone with Owen, his own son, who was 22 years old and had come from where he was living in North Platte for the funeral. Gareth gave him a folded piece of paper. He said he had found it in the drawer of the desk in his father's bedroom, behind a photograph taken in 1923 of Heinrich and the boiler that appeared to have been taken the day the boiler was completed. In the photograph, Heinrich was standing beside the boiler with the posture of a man standing beside something he had made and was satisfied with, and the boiler looked exactly as it looked now. Same dimensions, same proportions, same cast iron construction, because it was exactly as it looked now, the same object in the same location 80 years older. The paper was Heinrich's handwriting, not Rupert's, the handwriting of a man who had learned English late and wrote it with the careful attention of someone for whom each word was a small act of translation. Owen unfolded the paper and read it. Heinrich had written it in 1923, the year he built the boiler. He had written it in English that was imperfect in its grammar, but was not imperfect in what it said. He wrote, "I build this because in Moravia, I watch winter kill men, not cattle, men. The cold comes and the fuel runs out and the fire goes out and the men die. I see this when I am young and I carry it with me. In Nebraska, the winter is the same cold. Different ground, same cold. I build this so the fire does not go out. I build it so a man who tends it can fix it with his hands and not wait for someone else. I build it so the fuel is something we cut on ourselves and stack ourselves and cover ourselves, and no one can take it away or fail to deliver it or price it beyond what we can pay. Never let another man control the thing that keeps your family alive. Owen read this twice. Below Heinrich's writing in different ink and a different hand that Owen recognized as his grandfather's, there was one line. Rupert had added it in February of 1978 after the storm, after the accounting was done, and the extension report was filed, and the county had finished understanding what had happened to it in 4 days in January. Rupert had written, Heinrich was right. January proved it. Do not let Owen forget. Owen stood in the parking lot of the Catholic Church in Valentine, Nebraska, on a January morning in 2003 and read his great-great-grandfather's words and his grandfather's addition to them. The cold was 16 degrees. The sky was the blue that Nebraska produces after a serious winter storm, clean and absolute, and making its statement about the days that had preceded it, though in this case, the days that had preceded it had been ordinary winter days, and the blue was simply what January looked like here when there was nothing behind it. He folded the paper along Heinrich's original creases and put it in the inside pocket of his coat, close to where his body heat would keep it warm. That evening, Owen drove out to the Voss place with Gareth. They went to the calving barn. The boiler was running as it ran every calving season, the fire maintained at its steady temperature. The pipe along the walls warmed to the touch, the water moving in its loop. Owen stood in front of it for a while and looked at the cast iron of the firebox and the sight glass and the 60 feet of iron pipe that Heinrich had ordered from Omaha in 1923, and that was still doing the work it had been built to do. He opened the firebox. He took a piece of split elm from the stack against the wall and added it to the fire. He closed the door. He pressed his palm against the return pipe and felt the warmth of the water coming back to the firebox. Gareth watched his son do these things and did not say anything. The operation passed to Owen in full when Gareth retired in 2011. By then, the original boiler was 88 years old and had run continuously every calving season for all of those 88 years. Owen installed a new wood-fired hydronic system that year, a modern version of the same principle: fire heating water, water moving through pipe heating barn, no electricity required. The design was different, but the principle was identical to what Heinrich had brought from Moravia to Nebraska in 1894. The original boiler stayed in the barn. Owen did not remove it because Gareth had not removed it and Rupert had not removed it, and it would have been a different kind of removal than the physical one to take it out of the building where it had run for nearly a century. It stayed against the same wall connected to the same pipe in the same corner of the same barn. Owen kept it clean and kept the water jacket full and kept the firebox door oiled so it opened and closed without difficulty. Once a month through the calving season, Owen loaded the firebox of the old boiler and built a fire. He watched it catch and held his palm against the return pipe until he could feel the water beginning to move, and then he let it burn for an hour before he let it go out. He did this because his father had done it and because his grandfather had asked him not to forget. He had not forgotten. On the morning of January 12th, every year the anniversary of the storm, Owen went to the barn before first light. He went to the old boiler in the corner. He opened the firebox and built a fire. He added wood until the fire was fully established and the water in the jacket was beginning to warm and the pipe along the walls was beginning to tick with the expansion of iron coming up to temperature. He sat on the hay bale nearest the boiler and waited while the old barn filled with the smell that Rupert had known for 60 years and Gareth for another 20, and that Owen now knew the way a man knows a smell that belongs to the oldest and most essential part of what his life is made of. The smell of burning wood, the smell of warm iron, the smell of water heating in an enclosed space, the smell of a barn in winter that is the temperature it needs to be, not because the grid is running or the propane truck made its delivery or the automatic ignition found its signal, but because someone built a fire before the cold came and fed it while the cold was here. The fire burned for an hour. The iron warmed. The old pipe along the walls disconnected from the new system, but still in place, still the same original pipe that Heinrich had ordered from Omaha ticked and expanded in the familiar way of iron coming up to temperature after a period of cold. And the barn smelled like what it had always smelled like on this date in this building on this ground. It smelled like the decision a man makes before the storm arrives. It smelled like wood cut in July and stacked and covered and waiting. Like iron that has been trusted for a century and earned that trust every calving season. Like water moving through a loop by the simple physics of heat, the same physics that Heinrich had understood in Moravia before he was old enough to understand anything else, the physics that required nothing of the modern world to function, and that asked nothing of its operator except that he understand it completely and tend it faithfully. The Voss Ranch, Cherry County, Nebraska. Established 1894. 4 generations. The woodpile behind the barn is still the largest in the county. 3 months of seasoned wood stacked every summer covered before the first snow. The boiler ran every calving season from 1923 to 2011, 88 years. The fire never went out.